This is John Reid here for Canada's Anglo-Celtic Connections blog, and I've just had a delightful lunch
You're
with
too kind.
with Lucille Campey and Jeff Campey in their very nice home in the countryside just outside Salisbury. And we were talking about how you actually got into doing this. You were telling me you had done a PhD in Scotland, and then you were in Prince Edward Island.
Yes, I was halfway through doing this PhD. I was doing the research part of it, and I had. While in the archives, I'd spent most of my time studying the material relating to Belfast, which was the settlement which Selkirk managed and helped with funding for a large number of Highlanders to settle there. I think they came in about 1803. And I really, my main reason for wanting to go there, because we had a little bit of time to kill that day, was to see the church, because I knew that the Presbyterian Church, St. John Presbyterian Church, was still there. And I thought it would be interesting to see how big it was. So we got there and you would see the church on the hillside, and it really was quite a big church. And it was all set to go inside and look at the more details when I was struck by the size of the cemetery. You could see gravestones, row after row of them in very uniform rows. And it was on a sloping site, so you could look down into a valley, and then beyond you could see into the distance, you could see mountains. And all the way through, you could see the green fields of farms in front of you. And I started to look at the gravestones, and which you tend to do, don't you, in cemeteries? And I noticed that the places that the people came from were places either in Inverness or in the Inner or Outer Hebrides, like places like Skye. Which shocked me, because I knew these were places that hardly had any trees. And Samuel Johnson went to Skye. He said that he'd counted 5 trees, none of which was taller than himself. And I thought, and as I walked past these gravestones, I thought, how on earth was it that people who had probably never seen a tree before had come here to clear the forest and establish Belfast? And it just blew my mind, actually, that this was the case. And it made me appreciate just how little I understood about pioneering and pioneers, and that there was this vast human context which you have to see. It's not just about what the government decided to do or the mechanics of how the shipping worked. It's about the fact that you're dealing with incredibly brave people and tough people, fearless people who went to these places and made a success of it. And the quality, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying this, the quality that Selkirk was looking for in recruiting people wasn't whether they could chop a tree down, because it's something you could be taught. He was looking for people who were resilient and who could cope on their own, who would not find isolation difficult, and who could rise above their fears. And he was obviously right, because this was an extremely successful place. So I went away a very humbled person. I went away having appreciated that sometimes being an academic and pouring through books does not always tell you what you need to know. You've actually got to go to see places. You've got to see the reality of what the subject is and the human side of it before you become just a tiny bit wiser.
Did that impact on your PhD thesis?
It certainly did. And it was then that I said to myself, somebody ought to write their story up, because it's not been told properly. It's all mechanistic stuff about what the governments did or didn't do, and about whether or not they were thrown off their land by heartless landlords or whatever. The actual toughness of the people and the chances they took in wanting to set up and start a new life were just so incredible. I thought they should be documented properly, and that we should try and understand why people left where they had been in Scotland and why they chose places they did in Canada, because that side of things has not been properly recorded or explained.
And that was your first book, the Selkirk?
Yes, indeed it was.
And then you went
Indeed,
on to do other Scottish ones.
Having done the Prince Edward Island story, the thing that was bothering me, a bit of unfinished business, when I was putting together the ship crossings, I thought to myself, do I know for sure that the shipping was as safe as it appeared to be for the Prince Edward Island settlers? Because I found no case of a ship never having made it or having been any shipwrecks. And yet the background music to shipping at that period is all about nasty ships and nasty captains and terrible storms and how perilous it was to set sail. So I decided that one of the offshoots I would do of my PhD dissertation was I was getting this at Aberdeen University, was to go through all of the Aberdeen newspapers, which were accessible to me at that time on microfilm, and check to see whether every ship that left Aberdeen with immigrants actually got to its destination in one piece. And I found that they had. And I checked that over many, many years. And on that little sample, I concluded that shipping was well managed and well run. And then I decided, well, it must have been well run, but let me see if I can prove that. And so I went into the ownership of ships and how they were made, and that led me into the Lloyd's shipping register, a very valuable tool in which the insurance you paid as a shipper was determined by the quality of a ship, so hence an extremely reliable indicator of the quality of a ship, and so on. So that second book was Fast Sailing in Copper Bottom, which was the sailing ships that took immigrant Scots from Aberdeen, the Aberdeenshire area, to Canada, based on that work that I had done, following pretty well every ship that left Aberdeen with immigrants. And that, having done that, I then went on to deal with Nova Scotia and the various provinces.
Yeah. And I mean, people talk about coffin ships, but was that the era in which people talk about coffin ships?
Well, the coffin ship was coined really, I think, more in relation to the famine period, when there were so many deaths at sea, and in a way that if you had people dying in the ship from disease and they were confined in a space, it was a coffin ship, wasn't it? I mean, it was a coffin ship is perhaps not a bad term in that sense, but to use it as a derogatory term to cover shipping is monstrous, because the immigrants of the period had the best quality shipping that was available, because they were bound to have, because the ships went empty across to Canada, and in order to increase their profits, the shippers had, if they were going to attract immigrants, they had to provide safe and reliable and pleasant transport. They had nice captains who'd make you feel confident that you're going to be all right and care for you when you were ill. So it was, as it turned out, the immigrants did quite well out of shipping in that period, as well as could be expected, because their fares were actually the much sought after profit by the shippers.
So you started out with the sort of the Hebrides people.
Yes.
Who you said were really made of good stuff.
Yes.
Did you find could you say the same thing about the other Scots and then the English and then the Irish?
Well, I think it was a general characteristic of immigrants, and I wouldn't like to say that Scots were braver than the English or that Irish or whatever. You can't compare it in that way. I think one of our problems today is because we're quite cosseted compared with them, because we have all our modern conveniences, and we have such an easy life. We're just expected never to feel cold, not to feel hungry or all these other things. Life just seems so easy for us. The British and Irish immigrants who went to the New World had to be tough in order to survive. And I wouldn't like to choose between them. I think one of the key differences that you could look at here, though, which is getting into politics, is that it was more likely that in England, particularly in the late 19th century, where you would find that there was an excess of labour in England and therefore not an awful lot of poverty. And the British government took the opportunity to fund the immigration of these poor labourers to Canada, and the kind of line taken was that, well, they were going to get a better life and Britain was not going to have so many people in its workhouses because of this. But the problem that Canada had with this attitude was the people coming in huge numbers to Canada in the late 19th century tended to come from cities, did not know the first thing about farming, and what Canada was crying out for were agricultural labourers to help with the farms. And so that met with a fairly crusty response in Canada, as you can imagine. And English labourers had a very bad name as a result of that, because they were seen as lazy, inadequate for what was being required of them. And it was really a rather unfortunate situation for the labourer to be caught in and for Canada to be caught in. And so you could say that it was a little bit unfair, if you like, of Britain doing that at that time. But that was what was done. And it was more likely to happen in England because of the fact that the English were more inclined to want to go to Canada than the States because of the links with the British Empire. And there were just an awful lot more English who were desperate to leave and who were suffering terrific poverty.
Now, that wouldn't be true of the Irish, who were, by and large, agricultural people when they came to...
They wouldn't be true of the Irish, because there was an awful lot of anti-Irish feeling in Britain at that time, as you get into the late 19th century, with the rising in support for Irish home rule, and sometimes violent outbreaks. There was an anti-Irish feeling building up. And also the Irish themselves were not too keen on Britain because they didn't like the Protestant, Catholic Irish, didn't like being in a country that had a Protestant crown. And it also didn't like the feeling that they were seen as being awkward and disruptive when they were looking for the sort of self-government the Canadians enjoyed, and they couldn't see why Britain wouldn't let them have that sort of self-government. So there was the people the Irish who came to Canada in the late 19th century were therefore self-funded, and you wouldn't go to the prairies to do an ordinary job in a town. You would go there to take advantage of the vast economic opportunities that farming offered you in the prairies. So the Irish who went to the prairies were very positively motivated and usually had farming experience.
And this is the subject of your your forthcoming book.
Indeed.
Which you're working on at the moment?
Absolutely. The Irish in Canada. That's right.
So is it general about Canada, or is it more specifically about the West?
It's the third of a series. The first one was the Irish in Atlantic Canada. Yes. The second was the Irish in Ontario and Quebec. And this one will now incorporate the prairies in BC and take an overall look at them. Some new material in it. I've quite fortunate in the sense that the major Irish landlords who funded the immigration of their tenants during the famine years were English with estates near here. Like you had the Marquis of Bath at Longleat, and that was a fun day out. We didn't actually go and see the lions, but it was a wonderful, 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 wonderful day when we went to the Longleat archives. So the Marquis of Bath papers were very interesting. We had Colonel Wyndham at Cirencester, West Sussex archives, and he assisted an awful lot of people from counties Clare and Limerick, and the Lord Palmerston papers, which are in Southampton University. Lord Palmerston assisted an enormous number of his immigrants, and they've got some some passenger lists as a result of these excursions, and I've also got a lot more background information about the thing in particular which I had not appreciated before was the fact that the landlords gave the tenants assisted passage to Canada, which was grabbed, I might tell you, with both feet and both hands and both feet, because they were desperate to go. But having done that, they agreed with the landlord that once they got established, they would send remittances back to their friends and family so they could use that money to go. And the thing that study of these landlord papers taught me that I had not appreciated before was how misrepresented the landlords who assisted tenants in the famine years, how misrepresented their actions were. Because it should be remembered that the majority of Irish landlords did not assist their tenants. They just kicked them out, left them by the side of the road and said, "You find your own way, mate, nothing to do with me," which of course was heartless and cruel and dreadful. The ones who actually provided their financial help they were the ones that got battered by later historians as being the terrible swine who made their tenants go on ships and who made them suffer and who made them go to Canada. And it is just a gross misrepresentation of what happened. These were the good guys. They were the ones who actually forked out the money, a lot of money, to send hundreds and hundreds of people to Canada in decent ships. They all chose A1 ships for their tenants and gave them enough money to get to their destinations. And although there were, of course, because of the spread of disease, there were fatalities, some dreadful ship arrivals. One or two of them where over 100 people died on the crossing. But nevertheless, these, you can see from the papers and the reports of the agents they used, they were always trying to look to the tenants getting a safe and good crossing, and working with the tenants from the point of view of, well, if everything goes all right for you and you've got the money saved, you might send it back and more people would go. And that is what happened. That is what happened.
Yes. So it's perhaps not as black a picture for all
the depiction of the famine years and the landlords who assisted tenants is completely screwy. It's unfair and totally wrong. There was terrible happenings during the famine, and many tenants just got kicked out of their properties with no support at all. There's no doubt about that. But that should not be used to blacken the story of the immigration story.
So we will have a better picture of this when you finish this book, which is coming out in September.
It's going to be coming out in September, and I have to finish writing it at the end of January.
Okay, and we hope to see you in Ottawa and Canada in
September. I hope so too. I would love to be able to go there.
Yeah,
I really would. I'm hoping I will try. I will be submitting a proposal to the HIFSCO in the hope that they will invite me to speak.
Great.
That I will be given the opportunity to speak.
Okay. Well, we'll put a word in then.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lucille.
Thank you,
Appreciate
John.
you taking the time.
Thank you.